This is why, by the way, and I'll come back to explain this again, this is why we say winning 3 moves in each one. This is what it means. Move 1 is to make contact with the opponent. Move 2 is to disrupt their structure. Move 3 is to hit them in that split second. If you do that, then you've won in 3 moves. It doesn't mean that you've won the fight. It means you've won that exchange. This is how each one is supposed to function. This is something that Wang Xiangjia explains explicitly, that this is what it's about. And he particularly favoured move their direction one way and then you change and hit back in the other direction. That was his favourite way of doing it. He explains that. But you don't actually have to do that. You can, like, for example, push them and then hit, so everything keeps going in the same direction. This is the essence of each one. This is what it's about. This is the idea. And this is when people are talking about, well, each one's about self-defense and stuff like that. It's about real fights. Comes from this idea. But it's just as applicable to sports and, you know, sport fighting. So it's a bogus argument, usually made by people who can't do either to any effective degree. And that's what we need pushing for. You know, that's in purely fundamental Yiquan terms, like the core Yiquan that Wang Xiangjia was doing. That's what pushing is for. That's the moment, and that then starts leading into other technical theoretical understandings that we've looked at. For example, the idea that your Fa Li is not necessarily a big powerful movement. So this is where people go wrong. They think, usually because of these people now who kind of hijack the discussion. I understand the heart's in the right place. They want to promote Chinese martial arts, but they're doing it the wrong way, right? They're saying Chinese martial arts works because it should be like boxing, or it should be like karate or something like that. When you do that, you just erase Chinese martial arts. You might as well say, well, just do that then. There's nothing unique about Chinese martial arts. So the heart's in the right place. It's trying to promote Chinese martial arts, but it's actually erasing it. Whereas actually, certainly in Yiquan, Fa Li might have a literal meaning in the Chinese dictionary, but that's not the point. It has a technical meaning amongst a group of people who have technical expertise. Just like, you know, for me as a social scientist, culture has a different meaning to the way that most people use it. So specialist expert groups have technical meanings to terms. So in each one, Fa Li has this very technical meaning of a short, sharp, explosive movement. And that doesn't have to be big or powerful. It doesn't have to be a massive right hook. It can be a very small movement. And the reason it can be a very small movement is it doesn't actually take that much to move someone's arms. And it doesn't usually matter that much if they're, you know, there's a point where they're so much stronger than you that it makes a big difference. But for a lot of people, if you can just move them quick, even if they're pretty strong, if they haven't got the reactions to suddenly brace, that's when you can hit them in that moment really fast and get that force magnification effect, even if they're much stronger than you. Remember, this is the solution that Wang Xiangjia comes up with about how do you develop skills that can help you fight people who are bigger and stronger than you. So once you understand that it can be a small movement, then that kind of opens the door to everything else about how do we maximize power. So one of the ways that we can maximize power in a small movement is thinking about how we set the posture. So if your feet are flat on the floor when you do a small movement, then you can create more of this, what Wang Xiangjia calls rebound effect, what we call in the modern Yiquan setting a posture. Like there's more contact with the floor, so it creates this stronger structure so that the energy that you create from a short, sharp movement can transmit more effectively into the posture, because you try to maximize every ounce of power into the potential power into the technique to make it function. So usually if we do like a short movement, like in push hands or something like that, we won't usually do a pivot root, because a pivot root obviously brings the foot off to the floor. It gets another joint involved, and joints dissipate force. So if it's flat on the floor, it creates a more solid structure that can transmit force better. It doesn't really transmit force, but it makes the structure solid. Like people talk about transmission of force, but really it's about eliminating dissipation of force. So an ankle joint can dissipate force, whereas if it's solid onto the floor, it doesn't dissipate that force. So you can save some of that force in a short movement. So if you do a short, sharp kind of push hands movement, usually you do it with very flat-footed rooting in the heels, slam down into the floor. It might be a tiny little thing just to help create some of that extra rebound force from hitting into the floor. But that's compensated for if you do a jab or something like that where we use a pivot route. You don't have to, but if you use a pivot route, that's lost. But what's gained is you can turn around your vertical axis much more effectively, so you can generate much more rotational Fa-Li. That is more effects than you would get from keeping your foot flat. So it's a payoff. So these are technical, theoretical things that you can learn naturally. But do you really want to spend years trying to learn them and work them? And people will watch endless hours of nonsense about Chinese martial arts and never get anywhere. But whether people will be interested in actually listening to me talk about stuff that actually functionally works and is the actual genuine authentic theory and practice of each one. It's amazing how few people really care about that, but that doesn't matter. That's the other thing, right? Like each one's not really for everyone, is it? So I know there's this thing at the moment, like each one for everyone. Yeah, it is. Let's be honest, it isn't. Some elements of it can help anyone, but serious, life-sacrificing practice for what, It'd be better off in many cases just to live an ordinary life, enjoy your life, but, if you have that thing that drives you, you have to become a wushu master. It just is that thing that animates you. Then this is the kind of knowledge you need, and you need it as fast as possible. But you still have to develop it. And it's not like you can get it just from being told it, but it can just save you so much time. Just decades of time trying to work all this stuff out if someone has gone through it, done it before, other people have learned it, honed it, and this is just as what's happened with every generation. Anyway, so with a short movement like in push-ons, we usually use that flat heel rooting, but rooting is more about how you position your balancing. Setting the posture is about how you save force that you generate, you prevent it from dissipating. Certain postures when we push change this dynamic, because if you've got your hands on someone, then you don't need to bridge, you don't need to close that gap and to hit them. But if you then want to push them, you've got to go further. You've got, in distance wise, you've got to close that gap to get your hands on them. So that starts changing the dimensions of what you can do with your rooting. And it means that you've got to, first of all, develop the intuitive ability to do it. But if someone can explain it, save you so much time. There's so many times when people are doing push-ons where it's the most elementary stuff. Like I've said before, like the biggest problem we'll look at when we come to do push-ons, people who don't understand the four contexts, open, close, rise and sink. Well, there's five actually, because hold the center is the fifth context, and those are the five elements in each one. This is, by the way, what you learn in Jianwu. I think most people don't understand that Jianwu was taught to Wang Shangjai by someone else who'd kind of redeveloped it based on his own martial arts understanding and some cave paintings, but also it's like a kind of natural understanding of physical movement. And Jianwu, as Wang Shangjai was taught it, has four elements, and those four elements are open, close, rise and sink. And one of the things that Wang Shangjai wanted his own students to kind of intuitively develop was the understanding of fluid movement between open, close, rise and sink, and that's one of the things that Jianwu is supposed to develop. You see so many people who've only learned how to use contexts in one direction. Remember, context can reverse and mirror. So they're two different things. I won't rehash it, we've looked at it before, but depending on whether you're pulling, for example, and pushing, changes the way we think about the context they reverse. It doesn't matter which terms you use, you've just got to understand the theory of it. So you always see people in push on, they're like, when you're breaking it down scientifically, why am I losing like that? Why am I getting pushed so easily? That they don't understand that they've used the wrong context. So you have to be able to do postures with their, what we call, in simple terms, their A settings and their B settings when you're pushing. So all of that kind of theoretical knowledge, do you use open or do you use close? And do you use a pivot route or do you keep the route flat? How do you set the posture? All of that kind of technical knowledge, yes, it has to develop intuitively, but also it has to be learned in practice. So let's say the first one that I'm going to look at, so I'll finish by talking about that, is the forearm push. So let's say particularly the lead forearm push. If you're going to do it with maximum power, you do it with a flat set because you want to get that rebound effect. But if you do it with a flat set, you've got to push with this part of your arm. And one of the things that some of the bag work exercises I'll show, people think like they've got a very springy structure, but then they find like if a bag just pushes in against your arm, it just pushes your arm in like that. You're nowhere near as defended and springy as you think you are. So if you want to hit with this part, like a kind of hammer fist like that, that's a totally different posture to the forearm push. If you forearm push kind of flat like that with this posture, there's no power in it. So you have to compensate for that by release force more from the elbow. So these are again technical details that you've got to understand. But if you want to do the actual forearm push, it takes that joint out of the equation. So you've only got this joint to push through. And it's got very limited range to push forwards because it's not like an elbow. So the difference between a forearm push is that goes flat out and an elbow comes in like that. So it gets more volume on the joint. Whereas a forearm push is just relying on the expansion of the whole structure. And that really is like down to like a Chinese inch or something like that. And your opponent usually isn't near you, so you can't get away with that. So how do we use theory to help us understand how to do that better? And the first thing is, well, you start thinking about fight theory and also other theory that we've looked at before, compensatory force. So you do a step. To close that gap, you do a step and step in. This is one of the things with fixed step push hands, which I don't think is a completely redundant practice, but the benefits are very quickly outweighed by the negatives. It's the same with any training exercise. If you do freestyle on the punch bag, there's some benefits there in a very limited amount, particularly around fitness, but it soon starts drilling in lots of bad habits. So the negatives outweigh the benefits. So for bag work, you should, generally speaking, always be doing drills. Similarly, fixed step push hands takes away 90% of the stuff that you actually need to practice, which is like, how do you integrate all of these techniques with footwork so that you can actually engage with? The reason people do that kind of fixed step and even push hands training itself and taking it into competition and stuff, I'm not against it, but the reason that evolved is because it cuts out the most difficult part, which is how do you engage with the opponent and bridge without getting smashed in the face, which is not easy. So to make all of this stuff work, this kind of Yiquan stuff work, how do you move in, how do you engage? This is why Wang Shunjai likes to wait for people to come in. He talks about this, it's not something I'm just making up, he talks about this is how his Yiquan functions. How do you close that gap? One of the things that push hands does is it takes that element out of the equation, and then fixed step push hands, even worse, takes out all the complexities and technicalities of how do you time a posture, how do you set a posture, how do you think about your defence not getting sparked out when you move in, how do you engage the opponent, how do you do that winning 3 moves without getting knocked out. Anyway, to make the posture work, the easiest way is just to do that, step in, but then you've got to think about, right, okay, well, how do I land the footwork? So here's where you start thinking about, okay, this is why you want to do seeking step a little bit flat, but then you want to just turn around the horizontal axis a little bit, release force, and then you've got to time it just right, because the Farley itself is like a Chinese inch, but the step itself is that much, and then that gives compensatory force, makes it more powerful. So these are concepts that you can understand and make sense of by having the correct theory. Theory is just coaching, but put into words. Let's say the problematic that you're given, and that's the one that we're going to look at first, is how do you just do it off the spot? So you're not going to use any kind of step in, so you can't close that gap, there's no compensatory force. And if you just do flat-footed set of the posture, like that, just little, what we call it bug scraping rooting wages, or like where you just do that with the foot. Yeah, you can do it like that, but that doesn't close enough of the gap between you. Like if you stand in front of a punch bag and your lead hand is very close to the punch bag, it doesn't even close enough of that gap for you to do that, for you to hit the posture, to hit the bag at the correct release force point if you do that kind of bug scrape routing. So you can't reach the target. So that's not the solution. It's different if the opponent closes in, of course, but if your idea is like, well, they're near enough, but just not quite near enough, like what do you do? So you've got to change the way that you do the posture. So you've got to get some kind of lean into the posture just a little bit. If you lean too much, it starts becoming really dangerous for you. And also you disconnect your structure so you can't transmit the force that you've generated. If you don't lean enough, you won't make it. You won't get over there. So there's a little bit that you can lean in. But if you just add in a little bit of pivot routing, that allows you to lean in a little bit more. But again, you've got to be really careful because you never lean over a pivot route, so that makes it a little bit more dangerous. And also you're close range, so it's easy for, even if your opponent just steps forward, just for them to knock your foot when you're doing a pivot route. But that's how you do it. You do it with a pivot route, so it just gets a little bit more rotational axis, and that allows you to extend the posture a little bit. So these are all examples of why we need to understand this kind of theory. We need to put it into practice when we're actually working on the pushes that I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to go through a whole set of things: rear hand, lead hand, different kinds of pushers, double pushers, how we understand how we use the routing, how we understand the contexts, how we understand the force generation and force transmission. So these are all things that we've looked at theoretically, now they start going into practical use. And then I'm also going to look at, I'll think about the timing because I want to get onto sparring and sparring related stuff, but I want to do push hands before that. So I've got plenty of stuff where we're looking at pushing into punches and stuff like that, which is a little bit more relevant to sparring. But all of this stuff that we're going to learn now, number one, it's all the stuff that all your shielding and all your standing has been building up towards that. And, understand, like, I don't do too much stuff on that one. For one, there's loads of really great stuff out there already on it. What we need is how this translates into practical fight training. But you know enough about that stuff just to keep practicing it and exploring it. But this is what we're practicing that we now bring into actual practical use. We need this stuff now so that we can then transition into the push hands training, because these are all the practical skills. Push hands really is just a format where we can kind of bring these into the next kind of more alive way of doing these postures and techniques. And if we do it the right way and think about how we understand our context, think about the dynamics of the movements, then it will elevate all of your push hands onto an entirely different level. And you genuinely do not get this just by doing more push hands. I think, just to finish off, this is one of these glass theory things where people are talking about intuitive development and they completely misrepresent what Wang Xiangjia is talking about. Yes, it's true that Wang Xiangjia didn't like systematized versions of Yiquan, but it's also true that without that he couldn't really teach it. And he says himself, like, most of his students just didn't get it. So it's not like he's right about everything, but he also talks about, understanding that scientifically the mechanics of physical movement. You can't just, so the classic example, right? You can see people who do bag work, you can see people who do sparring. At the gym you see people 5 years later, they're training regularly, they're doing bag work, they're doing sparring, and they're no different. There's no difference in level. They've got a bit stronger maybe, so there's a little bit more power, but there's no difference in technical level. So just doing the same thing, even just this thing that people say that, what makes Chinese martial arts work is sparring. That's not true. People can do sparring for years and never get any better. That's not the way it's done. Similarly with push hands, you can do push hands for years, you can develop some kind of intuitive knowledge, but clarity becomes your enemy at a certain point. You're always training with the same people, you're always making the same things work. It's only when you're challenged with different things, different people, different scenarios that you then start finding out, why didn't that work? That always works. Yeah, but that's because that other person always does that thing and that always works. But if someone does something else, you need to actually reverse the context, or the context needs to be mirrored. And if you don't understand, if you don't have that theoretical knowledge, you're just left like thinking, oh, that person's so much better than me. No, that's not it. It's like, it's your technical understanding. If you have the technical understanding, you can go away and say, okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm using this context and I'm going this way. Well, actually, what if I use the other context? Or what actually if I need to use sync? Actually, maybe I should be using rise there. Maybe I should be reversing the context. Maybe it's mirrored context because I'm hitting out to the side. I'm hitting at 90 degrees, and that changes the context usually that you're using. When open, close, rise, sync. It changes the context that you're using when you hit out at 90 degrees, and all that stuff that seems like really arcane theory. That makes all the difference in being able to problem solve. And those people who say that you don't need that, well, that's why they can't demonstrate anything, or they're just stuck at one level for the rest of their life, and because they never get out of their bubble, they never understand that that's not sufficient. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to move on. We're going to look at all of that stuff, and then hopefully we can get on to push hands, which I'm really interested in doing, because it's not something I show loads of, but like everything else in each one, I've made like a very in-depth lifetime study of push hands, so I've got a lot of stuff to share on that.